to have you all, so thank you so very much. And it's wonderful to see this turnout of students and faculty and administrators, so thank you so very much for coming. I would like to thank our interim dean of the School of Social Sciences and Education, Dr. Tanya Boone-Holliday, for coming. Yes, please do. Thank you so much. We also have our former dean in the audience, Dr. Steve Bacon, so thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Dr. Doris Hall, the Chair of Criminal Justice. We're really excited to be partnering with the Department of Criminal Justice, the Pre-Law Society. And I also, in the back, because I caught her eye, and I'm not sure how long she'll be here tonight, Jenna Lord, for all she did for all amazing, and I'll let Dr. Hall thank the others in the audience, but thank you so much for coming, and we're looking forward to our conversation this evening.
Hi, thank you so much for being here tonight. We're really excited to have such a great panel. And I also want to say a quick thank you to the CJ Event Planning Committee that worked with Dr. Crado on helping getting this event going, with Dr. Callie Nicola and Professor Lindsay Nelson, and Jenna Lords. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over now to Micah Nilsson. He's the chair of the advisory board for CSUB's Pre-Law Society, and he'll introduce the panel.
I just made an executive decision to sit instead of standing up for this. So thank you for being here. I'm excited. We just spent a few minutes, and I had met some of the panelist members before. Some of them I just met tonight, but I'm really excited for the discussion that's going to follow. Just by way of background, I do not have a lot of experience. I have almost no experience in the juvenile justice program. I'm an attorney, but I do civil litigation. I have done some research and looked into it, and I know enough to know from that discussion in 10 minutes that I still know nothing about juvenile law, and so it's going to be a good discussion. We do have a great 4 panelists, and I'm going to introduce them in order going to my left. We have Melissa Allen, who's with the Kern County District Attorney's Office. She's a deputy district attorney. She's been in Kern County for 20 years. She did her undergrad at Cal Baptist and her Juris Doctorate from California Western School of Law in San Diego. She has supervised the Family Violence Unit and is now assigned to the Juvenile Branch. As a deputy district attorney, Ms. Allen has prosecuted everything from misdemeanors to general felonies and special prosecutions, including child abuse, domestic assaults, sexual assault, and murder. And next to her is Robin Walters. She is the supervising deputy public defender of the Juvenile Division of the Kern County Public Defender Office, essentially Ms. Allen's counterpart on the defense side. She's a Bakersfield native and did her law school at UOP McGeorge School of Law. She has a background in criminal defense, adult criminal defense, and has practiced in the juvenile court for the past 19 years. She joined the Public Defender's Office as the supervising attorney, again for the Juvenile Division, and prior to that she was in adult criminal defense, also handling all manner of cases, including death penalty cases. She's also a community activist, self-styled co-director of Women's March, and many, many things. Next to her is Shay Moliner, who is the Probation Division Director with the juvenile programs here in Kern County. She received her Bachelor's of Arts degree in Criminal Justice and Master's in Public Administration from Cal State University, Bakersfield. She began her career with the Kern County Probation Department as an extra help group counselor in 1995. She was permanently appointed as a deputy probation officer in 97 and has served the department in a variety of positions, including placement, adult investigations, and Prop 36 supervision. She was promoted to Assistant Division Director in 2008 and held this position at the Kern Crossroads facility, Camp Irwin Owen, and Juvenile Hall. In 2015, she was promoted to Probation Division Director, and she is currently a Division Director of Juvenile Programs. And at the end, we have Salvador Aria. He is the Prevention Program Coordinator for the Kern County Superintendent of Schools. Salvador served in the U.S. Marine Corps for 8 years, worked for the Kern County Probation Department for 5 years, did his bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in social work, and has his pupil personnel services credential. He also has his preliminary administrative services credential. And Sal has been working with at-risk youth in our local schools for the past 11 years. He was instrumental in developing the Project 180, which is a very promising gang prevention model that uses social work, really blends the school social workers, and manages several programs including safe schools, child welfare and attendance, and other prevention programs for the Kern County Superintendent of Schools. So by way of format, we're going to give each of the panelists an opportunity to talk a little bit about their role within the juvenile justice program. There's no set agenda for this portion. It's really an opportunity for them to explain where they fit in, anything that's particularly of interest for them. And when we finish with that, then it's really going to be open to Q&A session. So during I'm going to call them introduction or preliminary remarks from the panelists, there will be note cards passed around that you'll be able to write questions down. And then you'll pass those. I don't know if we talked about the structure for that, but someone will be collecting those note cards and bringing them up. And so we'll read those questions so that the panelists can answer them. You can submit the questions anytime and just be patient because we should get to the questions, but it might not happen immediately when you get submit it. Depending on the format, because that can be cumbersome and you might have a question that's directly related to what's going on, and since I am moderating it, I get to decide to change it right now, which I am doing. Just raise your hand as well. One of the problems is that we don't have a microphone and we are live streaming it for the Antelope Valley campus, and so it will be available for streaming later for anyone that's interested. I will do my best to repeat the question so that it's going through the microphone for the audio visual, and then we can answer it there. So there's two methods of doing it. One, you can submit the card, but if it is a timely question, or I guess a time-sensitive question, just raise your hand, and we can address it right then too. Okay, I'm going to turn the time over to Ms. Allen, and we'll go from there.
Good evening. As you said, my name is Melissa Allen, and I am the prosecutor. I'm the only prosecutor right now out at the juvenile court. And to kind of understand, I think what we all do, just a kind of brief overview of juvenile, it's very different from adult court. Adult court, there is some sense of rehabilitation, but it's mostly about punishment, going to prison, going to jail, being on probation, things like that. The juvenile court and the juvenile justice system is focused on rehabilitation, and it's a collaborative court. So as we were just discussing actually in the when we met beforehand, when I was in adult court, dealing with defense attorneys was very different from dealing with Robin, who is one of the public defenders out there. What we talk about and how we talk about the case is very different. Police officers or the police departments, when they arrest somebody or write a report about something in adult court, they submit it directly to the district attorney's office. In juvenile court, they submit it first to the probation department, and the probation department screens it. In some cases, very low-level cases, will go just a warning letter. Well, I will never see it as a prosecutor. But most of the cases do come to me, and then I evaluate them and decide whether or not to file them. Once the case is filed, if a petition is filed, then that's when I start working with the defense attorneys, and we decide what might be the best outcome for this. We try to work together. I think we do a decent job of it. We do have some disagreements, obviously, sometimes, because I, as the prosecutor, also want to make sure that there is some accountability, and that basically means some punishment to some degree, but that can't be my sole focus, and that's hard as a prosecutor, to be honest, to not focus on punishment or things like that, because I cannot do that in juvenile court. I have to focus on rehabilitation. And so we will work together and try to come up with a resolution. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, and we do a hearing. In adult court, it's called a jury trial, and juvenile, it's called a jurisdiction hearing, and it's just a judge that's making a finding whether or not it's true, the petition, the charges are true or not true. And so I work with the officers to file cases, obviously. I also, on cases where we have victims, I'm in contact with victims and make sure that they have the opportunity to come to court if they want to do so, because under Marcy's law, they have a right in adult court and in juvenile court to express how this crime has affected them and different things like that. And so I work with the victims and going through the process. Most cases we are able to settle in some fashion. We only do a trial probably a couple of times a week on a busy week. Sometimes we have weeks where we don't do any trials because we are able to work the cases out. And when I say work the cases out, it can be anywhere from a sort of informal diversion program where we have we agree that the kid's going to come back in 6 months. And in 6 months when he comes back, he's going to bring in his report card or his progress report showing that he's doing well in school or improving on his grades. We're going to have him bring in something from school saying that he or she has behaved in school. And we're going to ask the parents, have they behaved? And then we'll dismiss the case. So we have that. We have kids that go to different programs that I'm sure Shay will talk about, the different programs that are available here. And the ultimate thing is DJJ, which most people know is the Youth Authority. And so we don't necessarily agree, and we can't agree on what the outcome's going to be. I can't agree with Robin. He's going to go to Crossroads. He's going to go to whatever. It's up to the judge. We agree on the charges, and then probation makes recommendations. We both will make our arguments for what we think might happen, but unlike adult court, we cannot agree on that as the attorneys. In adult court, they will agree on it, and the judge usually goes along with that. But in juvenile court, we just agree on what the charges are going to be, and then probation makes a recommendation. So that's a quick kind of summary of what I do. It's the same as any other prosecutor, but has some additional responsibilities, I think, because you are really focused on rehabilitation as opposed to the other things that you focus on in adult court.
Well, to pick up on her last thought, sometimes I feel more like I'm a counselor than a lawyer because of the difference in juvenile court versus adult court. Because truly the whole point of juvenile court, and we've gotten away from calling them, number one, delinquents, we really should focus on language because it is important, and that is their justice-involved youth. So with regards to the youth that we service, the focus is and must always be by law rehabilitation. And that focus has shifted tremendously in the last few years. As indicated, just from our office perspective, we represent minors charged with crimes, as well as minors removed for abuse and neglect, and that's all we represent in the juvenile division. Once in a while we have adult cases because a minor who is charged with a crime and maybe their case took a while to get to court, and we might be doing what's called a transfer hearing. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. Is an adult offender now, but at the time of the offense was a minor. But other than that, we only represent children. We have 4 lawyers. We're hoping to get a 5th. We also have 3 interns from Cal State Bakersfield in the MSW program, although I wouldn't mind a pre-law person. But we use them basically as social workers, because one of the things I would say is that when you do an interdisciplinary approach, including an interdisciplinary approach in juvenile matters that are pending before the criminal court, although again it's not criminal because it's juvenile, you have better outcomes. So when a client comes in, again with the same point that I feel like a counselor sometimes, I'll sit down and talk with a minor and I would ask questions that I might never ask of an adult. For example, how's school? Where are you going to school? I'm looking to see if they're at a continuation high school or a regular high school. How are you functioning in school? Do you have an active IEP? Do you have a behavior plan? Are you on any kind of medications? How is your behavior at home? What are the issues that you are facing day to day? Because many of us in the juvenile court have been trained in trauma-informed care, because most of all the kids that we see are trauma impacted one way or another. And that becomes very important. And again, it goes back to a whole interdisciplinary approach about children having suffered trauma in their life. And so that is a big part of why, ultimately, what I really want to talk about, and I'm super excited about, is the huge changes in juvenile law over the last few years. I do have a handout for everyone that kind of talks about some of the significant changes in juvenile law, which I'm sure we're going to talk about today. But in terms of what the public defender does, like I said, we defend kids charged with offenses. And while we might disagree, oftentimes in terms of what the appropriate disposition is, because it's not called a sentence, we call it a disposition, and we might fight vehemently about that. At the end of the day, we also collaborate and we recognize that the goal of the juvenile court is rehabilitation. And so we're able to talk matters out and see if we can come to an agreement.
So probation has a huge role in working in this whole road before a youth is actually, even goes to court. We have institutions where a youth may actually be arrested and brought into custody called juvenile hall. And at that time, the probation department will make a determination if they're going to detain the youth or if the youth is going to be released home. Oftentimes that will be one of the ways it gets the youth into the system for the very first time. I've been involved in all of our institutions, from our detention facilities as well as our commitment program. So a youth that's going through court, the probation officer is required to write a social study for the court, letting them know, what school they're going to. Everything Robin's asking the youth, we're actually generating and gathering this information to put into a report called a dispositional report, to provide not only the history of the youth, but also a recommendation to the judge what would probably be alternatives for what they can actually sentence a youth to. We have programs like work program, where youth may actually be ordered to do some volunteer work in the community based upon what was the disposition, all the way up to being committed to a program. Once a youth is released from custody, they're usually placed on probation, and this is an area that I actually supervise. So we have several units where they supervise the youth in the community to make sure they're following the terms and conditions of their probation. We have youth that are going to court and community schools, which Sal works with, called Bridges and Blanton Academy, that probation works very closely with, as well as our gang units, our foster community care reform units for youth that are on foster care or in short-term residential programs. We also have a lot of youth that are on either an aftercare program, which means they've come out of one of our commitment facilities and they're receiving more intensive supervision. It's that reentry is really important, so that a youth is supported when they come out of a facility so they don't go back. And then we also have a regular metro supervision. So typically right now in my division, we service about 765 youth that are currently on probation.
Too many.
Actually, the number's gone down quite a bit over the years, and we'll talk about that. There's been fundamental changes in the last 10 years to the number of youth that are actually on probation in Kern County, and the number has dropped in half since probably 2007.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Well, I'm not involved in this stuff right here. I work in the prevention side of the house. So you're probably asking, what the heck is the prevention side of the house? Prevention side of the house has to do with this, right? Well, just like Robin mentioned, I work with those kids who, we don't ask, why did you do this, as much as what caused you to do this. A lot of the youth that we work with are born into drug dependency, alcohol dependency. They've been abused in numerous ways, in all kinds of things. So that's what our job. We work in numerous different capacities to deliver school-based mental health or whatever the need of the individual is. So I used to work for Crew County Probation. I worked there for 5 years, and I got to work in the unit where Shay was talking about in regards to the intake unit. So I remember getting these kids in at 2 o'clock in the morning, at 3 o'clock in the morning on Friday, Saturday night, after being at a party, who made a bad choice. Made a bad choice, and here they are. I'm having them strip down, take a shower, put that powder on, and send them into a room, and I just hear them cry. Sit there and listen to them cry all night, because if they can take that back, that moment, they would. They would. And the reason I know that, because I've also worked with prisoners inside the institution, and you know what? They always say the one thing: if I could go back to that moment that led me here to be serving life without the possibility of parole, I would. And so that's the message that these guys deliver. And so that's what we do in the prevention side of the house. We try to get to that moment, to that fork in the road, to prevent these kids by meeting their needs. And what do we mean by meeting the needs? I grew up in Los Angeles, California, and I too was heading in that path. That's why we ended up in Bakersfield. Because of me, because I was making those wrong choices. But my mom said, no way, my son's not going to end up in this path, and we're moving. So we ended up in Cowtown. Sorry, guys. So we ended up here in Bakersfield, California, where I got the opportunity to make that change. And I ended up, joining the Marine Corps for 8 years, and that really changed my life. And I came back to serve this community. So I'm happy to be here. Also, I work with Dr. Hall. I taught a couple of your classes for gang prevention, and that's my passion, working with gang members. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. And by way of moving on, for the benefit of myself and those that the acronyms aren't familiar, DJJ, Division of Juvenile Justice, used to be Youth Authority. There's a bill going through right now that would transfer control from DJJ, or Juvenile Justice, to the California Health and Human Services Agency. The budget-related bill released Friday names the proposed new agency the Department of Youth and Community Restoration. So can we talk a little bit about what that means? What is the impact of, is it likely to happen where it's going to change from the Division of Juvenile Justice being responsible to the Department of Health and Human Services, and how will that impact the juvenile justice system?
Well, first I would start with the DJJ is actually under the Department of Corrections right now. And so the Department of Corrections, has all the prisons, and then DJJ is under their authority right now. And so it is going to switch. The bill has been signed, I think. Has it?
It's already.
Yeah, it's switched. Yeah, it's switched. And so it will be under Health and Human Services. And so honestly, I don't know really what that's going to look like myself. I know that some of my concern as a prosecutor is that DJJ is supposed to be the ultimate hammer, so to speak, holding over a juvenile, holding over them, don't rehabilitate here so you don't go there. And so while I know that DJJ has programs to rehabilitate, and obviously that's what we want, they should, they also have some part of accountability. And so I'm a little nervous as a prosecutor as to what's going to happen there. I have no problem, obviously, with Health and Human Services doing probably a much better job at the programs and the rehabilitation aspect of it. I'm just a little nervous about what that means in the accountability as a prosecutor, and I just have to wait and see what that means. I don't know.
And from my perspective, I hope it's a change more than just in the name of DJJ, which they're changing their name, and what's going on. I was at a roundtable at UC Berkeley last Saturday, and we talked about what the changes will be at DJJ. And the current director, who really was pretty good, has stepped down for health reasons, and the assistant director is the acting director. And that is a woman, and it's a psychologist, so that is one step in the right direction. Another step, from my perspective, of course, it's all from my perspective. The other thing that I think really might be more than a change in name only is If DJJ is now part of Health and Human Services, the focus on rehabilitation isn't just by name. It means they do their own recruitment, their own staffing, and their own training. Because right now at DJJ, because we can call it a hammer, but it's supposed to be rehabilitation. Right now, the people that work at DJJ are trained by CDC. That means they're trained correctional officers. They're not trained to work with juveniles. They're not trained to work with youth who have been impacted by trauma, and they're really not trained for rehabilitation. So the hope is that now DJJ will get their own academy and they'll train their own people to work in their various units. They have a long way to go. They actually have one of the models for sex offender programming, really nationally. They're pretty good on that, and they are strengthening their mental health. That's my understanding is going to be their focus going forward, but they're really behind in other things, including gang intervention. They do not currently have a gang intervention program, and they don't even know when they're going to get that. So if you're talking about rehabilitation and the types of youth who are at DJJ, that's something that we're hopeful that they're really going to work on going forward.
I think also we need to understand that DJJ, Kern County sends very few youth to DJJ. And that's not the case several years ago, but since 2008 with DJJ realignment, the focus was more on keeping kids here locally and addressing their needs here in our own community. And I still think that's the focus of the continual realignment of, say, of DJJ under Gavin Newsom. With the change in laws, I think what people have to understand is like DJJ is a state program, and Kern County Probation, who operates our local commitment facilities, is a county-run program. And so each county runs their programs a little bit differently. And since, for the last 10 years, our department has really put a focus on being trauma-informed care, providing services that are evidence-based, addressing the youth's criminogenic needs, making sure that our commitment programs are rehabilitative in nature to ensure that the youth, are really targeting their needs. Why did they get there? How did they get there? And how are we going to be able to support these youth that are actually here in our custodial programs? So DJJ, there's a lot of talk about DJJ and the realignment. Here locally, most of your youth that are being addressed here and treated here in our community.
I'm excited that it's gonna happen, really, to be honest. I'm with Robin on this one. Like I mentioned, I go a lot to the prisons and I see I hope we don't have no CDC officers out here, but I see the CDC officers out there and they're very, one way. It's all about, for me, my perception, kind of like what Robin mentioned, is all about the punishment. And for me, it's not about the punishment. How do you incarcerate a foster youth who, if you get to know their story on how they were violated, neglected, whatever the case might be, would let them to, create their harm, to self-medicate with opioids, when they're being heroin, when they're doing an armed robbery, to go off to prison for the rest of their life. It's like, it's not so much why, it's like, what happened to you? What happened to you to let you to that path? So I'm excited because now if they're going to be doing their own hiring, then they're going to be providing their own professional development, which would include maybe a lot of more therapeutic approaches on how to work with youth.
The first question from the audience that I'm going to read is, can you please ask the speakers to talk into the mic?
Oh, sorry.
So I know you're projecting, but part of it is for the audiovisual. So that actually addresses some of the questions that the audience had as well on it. One is the primary shift that we're seeing from the juvenile justice system in regards to punishment versus rehabilitation. Is the shift from DJJ to the Department of Health and Human Services part of that kind of further emphasis on rehabilitation? Is that the goal?
The goal was always supposed to be rehabilitation. It's just now we're really doing it. But I think Shay really has the key. The goal of the laws now are to keep youth, because we know we get better outcomes, in their own community, in programs where they can have family and support systems. And that's why we are lucky here, because in Kern County and other counties that are this size, we don't even have all the choices, although I should mention that we mostly talk about boys because boys are by far the biggest issue, the biggest problem. But the focus is local, like all the programs that our Kern County Probation Department runs, like Camp Irwinoan, Pathways for girls. For boys, you have Camp Irwinoan and Crossroads, and she can probably talk to you about the programs that they have in all those institutions.
There's a collection and several questions that address the age at which a juvenile can be tried as an adult. And so I'm going to kind of read them together so that you can address them. This one is, what age do you typically see or deal with? What's the youngest age group? What's the most common type of case that you see? Has there ever been a case where a juvenile was tried as an adult? And there seems to be some discrepancy as to who is in charge, who is charged as a minor or as an adult. What are some of the reasons or details that dictate that choice?
So right now, the law's changed in the last year. Years ago, the voters of California passed, I don't even remember what it was called, but it basically allowed us to what's called direct file certain cases. That means that as the prosecutor, we could take certain charges for, I think it was 16 and 17-year-olds, and directly file them into adult court. For 14 and 15-year-olds, we had to do what's called a transfer hearing, or a, what they used to call it.
It used to be called fitness.
Fitness hearing, thank you. I couldn't think of the word. It used to be called a fitness hearing. And so what we would have to do is we would have to prove to a juvenile court that this juvenile should be treated, should be sent to adult court. The changes in the last year were done by the legislature. They took away our authority as a prosecutor to even request for a 14 and 15-year-old to go to adult court. They also took away our right to direct file a case, and now the only kids that can go to adult court are 16 and 17-year-olds, and we have to do what's now called a transfer hearing, which is kind of a step up from the old fitness hearings. And so a lot of the district attorney's offices, including ours in the state, are legally fighting that because we believe that the legislature overrode the intent of the voters of the state of California. We've appealed it to the appellate courts. There's, I think, 3 rulings against us right now saying that it was constitutional, but last week or the week before, a ruling came out from the 2nd District, published opinion saying that we were right. So now there's a split of authority. But in Kern County, we're covered by the 5th DCA, and they ruled against us. So that's kind of where that stands right now. But we look at the cases individually, and when we transfer a case to adult court, we're looking at the most serious offenders who have committed murder, is one of them. And when we used to do transfers or fitnesses on 14 and 15-year-olds, again, it wasn't just a ton of kids. It was the serious cases, the murders, committing robberies with guns, shooting somebody with a gun, attempted murder, those things like that. That's what we focus on for transferring. So right now, we're kind of operating under the rule, what the court has approved, and that we cannot transfer 14 and 15-year-olds. That's the rule right now. And so now we're left with just 16 and 17-year-olds. And when we're looking at those kids, we're looking at how many petitions have they had, how many times have they been before the court. If it's their first or second one, and they didn't commit murder or something like that, we're not going to transfer them. But we're looking at, did they use firearms in their crime? There's robberies that I have filed transfers that they're going on right now, and I look at how many times have they been before the court, what kind of treatment programs have they already been through, have they been through camp, have they been through Crossroads, different things like that, and the severity of the crime that they committed. As a prosecutor, obviously, I'm going to have a different opinion on this from Robin, I know, but 16, 17-year-olds, and even 15 and 14-year-olds, when you kill somebody, that's not just stealing something from the store. That's very serious, and we feel that we have to treat it as such. And so those are the cases that we think, even if a 15-year-old murders somebody, Not under all circumstances. There's still some 15-year-olds that should be in juvenile court because we don't know. We do look at their background. We do everything like that. But 16 and 17-year-olds, if they murder somebody, we're going to probably try to transfer them, obviously. And one of the things on transferring, the defense gets all kinds of records. We talk to the victim and things like that. And then we end up with a study from probation. And we really look at that. And sometimes when we look at that, we decide, you know what, okay, this kid needs to stay here because that social study has informed us of different things that we didn't know beforehand. So there have been some transfers that have been dropped in the last few months because of the report that came back or because defense has had their doctor evaluate the child and let us know. And so there's just a lot going on in that world right now. And that is one of the big areas I would say Robin and I disagree on.
Right, because if you go back and look at the history, it used to be called fitness hearings. There were 5 criteria that the court looked at, and the prosecutor had the burden. If they just proved one of those criteria, and one of those criteria is the seriousness and gravity of the offense, which by definition you're having a fitness hearing. It's a 707B offense, which is the code section that delineates the serious and violent felonies. The DA would almost always win. That's in the old time when you had fitness hearings. Then it wasn't the legislature that took away, first the DA, then they got to directly file. So the judge wasn't even involved in the decision anymore. It wasn't even like, okay, only one criteria. The DA can just automatically, directly send youth to adult court. Then that changed with Prop 57, which was not the legislature, that was the voters of California. We're catching up with the science. And the science tells us that your brain is not developed until you're 25. So like Sal's talking about, oh my gosh, if I could take back that moment, we know that kids are impulsive, that kids do things without thinking. And so we're catching up with the science. And so in terms of transfer hearings now, after Prop 57, and then subsequently that changed, which I'll get to in a minute, but for those youth who have committed one of the qualifying crimes, which as I indicated, they're generally all serious and grave because they're a 707B offense, you have what's called a transfer hearing. We do not call them fitness hearings anymore. And there are still the same 5 criteria. And those criteria are the seriousness and gravity of the offense, the criminal sophistication, if any, of the youth, the prior history of the youth, the prior attempts at rehabilitation, for example, locally, and whether or not the youth can be rehabilitated within the time frame allowed by law. And generally, if they were to go to DJJ, they can stay till they're 25. So now all those criteria are looked at, and they are all weighed. And it's not like, oh my gosh, the DA proved one, so the kid's going to adult court. Now the judge looks at everything. Recently, under SB 1391, it's true that youth under the age of 16 cannot be transferred. Most of the appellate courts have gotten it right. There is one decision from September 30th that said it was not constitutional, but we're pretty confident throughout the state that it will be constitutional, so we will no longer transfer youth who are under the age of 16, meaning only 16 and 17-year-olds can be transferred once you have a hearing. And generally those hearings, I haven't done one yet, I know maybe a few people have, but I've always called experts and have not lost any. But it took a lot in Kern County. Let me tell you, it was the one I won first took a lot of effort because we really were not there yet.
The youth that are actually going through this transfer process are actually sitting here in our juvenile hall waiting for the court process to go through. And their lives are in limbo, I mean, oftentimes. But what's happening to them while they're here in our juvenile hall is they have to go to school. They're having opportunities to see counselors. They're living a life behind bars. So, I've seen the transfer process when the court, when the voters changed the law. It used to be where a youth might sit in custody for a year until they were either transferred to adult court or off to DJJ. And it almost took 2 years for some kids that were going through the process that were actually waiting for the initial transfer process to take through and for the kids to go through court. It's been a fundamental shift on how things are done locally. But can you imagine just kind of waiting while you're in custody for, what's going to happen to you and where you're going to go? And you have to remember, these are, all youth under the age of 18. And as Robin said, their prefrontal cortex is not developed. And, it's, they might have committed a heinous crime, but they're also, when you kind of work with them, they're still kids.
So I had the terrible opportunity, I guess you would say, to be one of those people that shackle these kids up, put these chains around their waist, put the shackles on their feet, and buckle them up as they get ready to get transported to, at the time it was CYA, California Youth Authority. And I tell you, it's not fun. I remember the specific case of a young man who was a East Side Crip. And I remember as we were buckling him up, he had been hard. Shay mentioned they have a long period. They wait to be in the institution until they get transferred. And I remember the day he was being shipped off. He asked me if he could give me a hug. I was working the graveyard shift because they normally came in early in the morning, about 4 in the morning, to transport him. And I remember he asked me, "Hey sir, can I give you a hug?" And I said, "You sure can, man." And he gave me a hug. He goes, "Sir, you know what? Again, going back to wishing that he could take that moment back, but he couldn't. He couldn't. So I'm extremely happy that opportunity because to not try kids before the age of 18. Because yes, absolutely. You talk about the prefrontal cortex not being fully developed. I mean, most of you can't even get that insurance discount right yet, right? Because you're not even 25. Now add that trauma on top of that. Do you guys know what trauma does to the brain? Trauma affects that amygdala part of the brain. They live in the fight, flight, or freeze. So you don't have this thing up here fully developed, and then you have this little trigger up here. So it's kind of like telling a kid, "Would you mind taking out the trash?" It's like telling that kid to jump off a cliff because that's all they heard. And that's that part of the brain that just really affected. So you got trauma plus inability to process, put some logic and reasoning in there, and then you get that piece where you need to belong. You need to belong. You need that identity piece. And you know what? If you're not belonging to your house, guess where you're going to go? You're going to go look somewhere to belong. You're going to go look to belong in the streets and drugs and gangs, whatever the case may be. And so when kids, I actually have a question for the panel. Who are these kids who are committing these murders? And most likely to me, during the time were the kids who were involved in gangs. So, kids who are involved in gangs, they look for this sense of identity, this sense of belonging. And so what's the purpose of gangs? What is the ultimate, what is the goal of the gang? It's to commit a crime for the benefit of the gang, right? To put in work. So what is that work? So in order to belong, if my homie, the big homie says, "Hey, you know what? This is what you need to do to belong. Take this gun, I need you to take care of this business." Guess what he's gonna do? All right, he's gonna go do that shooting, right? So, but he didn't have that process. But I used to do this in my class when I used to teach out here in Cal State. I used to prove, to my class that most of you guys were gang members. Can we do that here? Yeah, can we? All right, let's see. All right, so the definition of a gang. Can you tell us, Shay, what the definition of a gang is?
Someone involved in a criminal enterprise for the purpose of illegal gain.
But it has to be 3 or more, right?
Yep.
3 or more, right? Okay, so how many of you guys hung around in junior high or high school with a group of 3 or more? Raise your hand. All right. How many of you guys claim a part of your territory in your high school or campus? They're like, "That's my tree. That's my handball court," right? All right. And how many of you guys felt kind of like, "Oh man," when someone else was there, wanted to do something about it, right? That's all a sense of belonging, all right? That's all the identity piece, right? And that's what a gang brings to these guys. So I'm actually glad that the way the system's moving towards, because you know what? We need to find out these guys have some mental health issues, and if we can address it ahead of the game.
Go ahead.
My name is Ryan. I have a question mainly for Robin. You say that children aren't mostly developed until they're 25. At what age would you say that the personal accountability of the person they need to be held accountable for? And would you advocate for raising the age of what constitutes an adult in the United States from 18 to higher? And with that, maybe response from him being from the Marine Corps, we send people off to war at 18. So would you say that that's necessary? Do you want to push that age to 25 as well?
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question. Ms. Walters asked, or the question for Ms. Walters is, she mentioned that the adolescent brain isn't fully developed until 25, so is there an age that you would recommend increasing the age of accountability or being an adult from 18 and going up? And then for Sal, having served in the military, is 18 still an appropriate age to send 18-year-olds off to fight in wars? Ms. Walters.
Well, I participated in the veteran stand down today, and so I might have a different response as to whether or not we ought to send anybody off to war. Be that as it may, when you question about personal accountability, I have never said in anything that people should not have personal accountability. What we're talking about is how you treat youth and make them accountable, and yet at the same time make them better. Really train them how to deal with the trauma or whatever it is that caused them to act impulsively, which we know they do. So yes, there can be accountability, but we don't have the same accountability for a decision in which a person is able to weigh the consequences and consider the nature of their actions. So sending a youth to camp or Crossroads or DJJ, I'm not saying they're not accountable. I'm saying that is the appropriate venue, and the focus ought to be rehabilitation rather than, and maybe I'm reading your question wrong, accountability in the punishment sense. To the extent they're stuck at juvenile hall and they're not going to their school or engaging in all the other activities that they might otherwise engage in, clearly there is a certain amount of punishment by definition. I don't know if that answered your question, but okay. I'll let Sal talk about.
So sending people off to the Marine Corps about the age of 25, I say no. I got out at the age of 25 and I was an old man already. You know, it hurts your bones. You're jumping out of helos. You're doing all this stuff, carrying this heavy packs. The young people need to be there. But you know, we got people getting in trouble in the Marine Corps. I made poor choices in the Marine Corps. I was arrested, as a matter of fact, 7 times in my last deployment, being in the Marine Corps, making poor choices. You know, the impulsivity's there. You know, it's on top of the trauma. You know, I'm not here to talk about my trauma, but if I had to share my experience growing up about my trauma and then my lack of impulsivity, you know, it really affected my decisions. You know. Responsibility, you know, we need to be held responsible. Absolutely, I totally agree with you. But you know what, at the same time, we have to be able to level the playing field, okay? We can't have, one team in baseball without gloves and bats, right? You know, we gotta make sure everybody has the same playing field. They have gloves and bats too. But, you know, a lot of these kids growing up, you know, they didn't have what most kids who end up being successful have. You know, they don't have 2 parents at home. They didn't grow up in a nice neighborhood. They grew up in a crime-infested neighborhood. You know, so, you know what? So these people who grow up with 2 parents in their house with great socioeconomics and all these things, they have a better chance of being successful. And so their parents teach them the rights and the wrongs. But how about those students who have a parent at home who, you know, is doing drugs and just can't parent? It's just not there. The playing field's not even for them. You know, and that's where, you know, I argue for. I argue to leveling out the playing field and giving you guys a chance. And I agree with Robin. You know what? It's not so much about punishment as much as what can we do to support them and, you know what, make them responsible people of society. So.
If I can just add one thing on that. when he's talking about different neighborhoods. You'll also see, I added some stats in here, it's kids of color. The system is still infected with privilege.
You haven't seen those because I haven't passed them out yet, but I will pass them out. I want to hit on a couple points. One is going to be trauma, and the other is going to be the demographics of the juveniles that you're working with. But first, I want to go back to the rehabilitation. If rehabilitation is the goal, the primary goal of the juvenile justice system, is it effective? Do we see less recidivism or repeat offenders than we do in adult criminal court? And are juvenile offenders more likely to appear in adult criminal court later on? Or is there a measure of success with the juvenile, kind of a measurable, demonstrable success accomplishing the goal for juveniles?
I don't actually know specific statistics. I'm sure Robin does, or Shay does. But what I would say is that we do see adults that that do have juvenile conviction, or not, they're not convictions, findings on their rap sheet. And it's obviously those ones that we didn't rehabilitate. A lot of those ones will be the ones that have several juvenile offenses on their rap sheet as opposed to a few. I would say that the majority of the kids that we see, probably a lot of them that we see them one time, and they do their probation and they are done, and we never see them again. They never see the criminal justice system again. I think the ones that we see again are the ones that there's a lot of gang problems, the ones that stay in the gangs and can't get out of those, and that does have a lot to do sometimes with their family, because their families are gang members and that's all they know. But the ones that we see repeatedly and we will likely see, I think, in adult court are the ones that are committing the more violent crimes, the ones with the guns. And we really don't have a lot of those crimes, but those are the ones that we are seeing again and again, the ones that are doing robberies, not just going into a store and stealing some beer or whatever, but full-on robberies where they take a gun into a store and demand the money. And we don't see a lot of those. We see a few a month maybe. But those are the ones that we're seeing again and again and are likely to see in adult court, I think.
So locally with recidivism stats, we do keep stats, but I think what's happening through, at least the last 10 years with our department is that we've been looking at research, and it says if you have a person who's at low risk to reoffend, then don't bring them into your system. Divert them out, because you're going to contaminate them. So it's called like the contamination theory. So we've been, really pushing our resources at the moderate, high, and high risk to reoffend, and then targeting our services to them. So it's kind of like dosage hours. So if someone's at high risk to reoffend, you want to give them at least 200 hours of targeted intervention to address why they're there. Is it, antisocial personality issues? Is it criminal thinking? Is it issues with their substance abuse, family engagement? So really targeting their needs. Yes.
For example, and you see that they're high risk, how is it exactly that you would identify them, and what is, like, paint a picture of like the program or something that would be done?
So our department uses a risk assessment tool to determine a person's risk to reoffend, and it's basically an open-ended questionnaire looking at different factors, and they ask questions of the youth, of the parent, and it comes out in this like a meta-analysis. It spills out some data, and it's going to say, is this youth low risk to reoffend, moderate risk to reoffend, high risk to reoffend? And for a youth that's high risk to reoffend, what does it mean to give them like dosage hours? It's like evidence-based services targeting their criminogenic needs. So if a youth has an anger issue, then you may want to place them in a group for aggression replacement training. If a youth has an issue with substance abuse, you may want to refer them to a cognitive behavioral intervention for substance abuse. All these things add up for hours. So it's not like you're going to get it in one shot, but over the course of maybe your probation term, what we want to do is increase the amount of exposure to dosage hours. So you may have a youth that is placed on probation and committed to our Camp Owen program. While they're there, they're going to receive groups to address their criminogenic needs. when they were released from custody, they may be placed on supervision and may have some motivational interviewing sessions with their probation officer. They may have some effective practices in community supervision. All these hours add up, and the goal is to get to that target of like 200 hours to hopefully reduce recidivism. It's 100 hours for moderate, up to 200 and above for high risk to reoffend. And the high risk to reoffend are the kids that we're now seeing. We're not seeing low-risk kids unless there's some sort of anomaly, maybe a sexual offender that may come into custody based on the gravity of their offense. What you're seeing in your commitment programs, in your juvenile hall, and your detention are those kids that are the highest risk to reoffend, or the moderate to risk to reoffend. So if we talk about population in the last 10 years, our average daily population in our commitment programs, when I first started, was like 120 at Crossroads. It's now down in the 40s. Our camp in Irwin Owens, the bed is 125. You can have 125 youth at Camp Owens. We're down in the 40s. Our juvenile hall, we used to be over 200 kids. We're down at 96 max cap. So there definitely has been a shift in who you're addressing in order not to, target. You don't want to mess anybody up. That's what we don't want to do.
On there's kind of a couple questions that relate to trauma. One of them overlaps with number of minors in the foster system that are seeing in there. And part of that is the statistics with trauma. Are you seeing a high percentage of foster or minors in the foster system coming through the system, through the juvenile justice system?
Since we represent foster youth as well, or youth in the foster care system, yes. The answer is yes. I think about 30% of foster youth end up becoming justice-involved youth. And in our county, you can only be one or the other, either justice-involved or foster care youth. I think everybody is looking at all the different reasons why a foster youth is more likely, so much more likely to become a justice-involved youth, and that probably could be ferreted out by the evidence-based programs that probation is using in terms of analyzing the data for trauma, family separation, incarcerated household member, mental health issues, which we have not discussed and I think are huge. We have really fallen behind in terms of dealing with youth with mental health. And I think we would all agree on that. We see lots of youth that need mental health services, and we just are not addressing those needs.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on that, because I have experience working at a group home too. These kids, we're going back to your question in regards to, these individuals that live in a group home. They're being parented by people who are getting paid, who they themselves most likely have experienced trauma, and they come with their own baggage and trying to parent these kids. And then, I don't know how they feel about the system, the foster broken down system that there is. But you know what? They're shifting over to something called FTRTPs, which it's more focused in services, which is great, but at the same time, they're removing some of the tools that group homes have in order to provide that responsibility for these kids. Like, for example, how many of you guys were asked by your parents to take out the trash and you had to do it, or you got in trouble, right? Try to do that with foster care kids. Try to have them have chores. And that's looked down as a punishment. As a punishment because you give them chores to do. So, sometimes that system does not allow, and that maybe has to be revamped too, because they have to be given some responsibilities, teaching these life skills that these kids need in order to be successful. And, I'm not saying harsh punishments for these kids, but just teaching them responsibilities and then get them involved in community programs out there too.
I was just going to add that I think also here in Kern County, we see a lot of foster kids because we have a lot of group homes, and we end up with a lot of kids committing crimes when they're in those group homes. They're from out of county, and they come here. And I think that another part of the problem is, if you're a foster kid, it's because your parents aren't available, basically, right? And so they tend to be on the run, I think. They tend to not stay where they're supposed to. And that creates all kinds of problems. And they're committing crimes when they're on the run because they're desperate and things like that. And so I think that, part of the problem is with the foster care system, you can't lock them up, and you shouldn't lock them up. I'm not saying we should lock them up, but because we can't make them stay someplace. They go on the run, they commit crimes and things like that, or they commit crimes in the group home, because I do agree with Sal that they don't have the proper treatment at a group home. And a lot of the group homes, those are kids they're foster kids, so they don't have their parents, and they're thrown into this other home with a bunch of other foster kids that, they don't know, with people that come and do 8 or 10 hour shifts, whatever it is. And so they're not getting the proper attention and care that they need. And so I think that also contributes to why we see a lot of foster kids in the system, in the delinquency side of the system.
Well, you just open up a whole can of worms if you go back to the foster care system when they're 3 years old.
Yeah.
So,
Locally in Kern County on probation, so there's a difference. You can be a foster care youth that's not on probation, and then you could be a foster care youth that is on probation. So there's a distinction, I think, that we were talking about, where how many kids in probation that are in foster care is about 160. So we have about 97 of those kids that are either in a short-term residential treatment program. It's supposed to be 6 months or less, and then they're supposed to be transferred out to a resource family, like a local foster agency. Or we have some youth that have reached 18, and so we have laws in place now to help support these kids that are now aging out of the system, called AB 12. And so we also supervise some AB 12 youth. So it's basically a little different. So sometimes people think, like, foster care youth, why are they being supervised by probation? Why is a kid who doesn't have a home on probation? It's just because of the fact is they've committed a crime.
So, to flip that, what portion of the kids in the juvenile justice system are foster youth?
The question is, what percentage or what portion of kids in the foster system or in the juvenile system are coming from foster?
that's not technically
Yeah,
foster
true.
care. Well, when you say that, technically foster care, that's a dual jurisdiction county. We are not a dual jurisdiction county. So you're either a justice-involved youth, or quote ward, or you're a dependent, which is a foster care youth. So when Shay's talking about the 166 youth that we have, their placement, their care is vested with the probation department, so probation places them. So it's similar to a foster care youth in the sense that instead of DHS, it's probation who actually is vested with their care. And I think she said we have 166, and now the great thing with AB 12 is kids not only can complete their placement on probation, but once they're 18, if they're doing well, oftentimes probation will recommend their probation be terminated, their record sealed, and they can still participate in AB 12 until they're 21, just like foster youth. And so long as they're going to school or working, they get $976 a month or something like that.
So I was going to ask that, is 21 the cap for AB 12? Once they hit 21, then they're no longer provided the services or the support services. What kind of patterns do you see with incoming juveniles? We talked about mental health, race, touched on poverty, and even single parent. Are those areas that are being addressed by the system currently? And kind of on the prevention side, I'm coupling some questions together. Are there programs that address fatherlessness with young boys particularly, and the role that plays in offenses?
So, the common trends, number one reason why kids are delinquent are lack of parental supervision. Most people do not get in trouble while they're being supervised by their parents, all right? If they do, there's something called oppositional defiance disorder. But most kids do not. So that's the number one reason. Number two is that the kids fear, do not have a fear for getting in trouble. So those kids to me are the most dangerous, because, like, for example, I had a kid who, he will be considered something called conduct disorder, who he got on a bus, in a school bus. He was only a 7th grader, got on a school bus, went all the way over to one of the high schools, beat up this kid on his campus in front of his homies, you know what, and then got back on a bus and got back. So that I said, weren't you scared? Weren't you scared of, number one, get beat up? Weren't you scared to get in trouble? And he said, no. You know, that's just how it is. So this is a kid who's been raised of not having respect for authority. And some of those kids are the most dangerous. And when you meet in front of them and you're talking to them, and you know, they're you know where they're going. They have this flat affect about them. They'll probably set some fires around. They'll probably have some, you know, peeing in bed. You know, they're really meeting that conduct disorder criteria. Those kids are some of the most scary kids because, you know what, so I also work in the schools and the safe school side of the house. So I study a lot of these active shooter kids, you know, and these are those kids. These are those kids who have that flat affect and just, there's nothing, something just doesn't click for those kids. So is there programs out there? You know what? So I mentioned earlier that I moved from Los Angeles to Bakersfield. So when I was in Los Angeles, I started, you know, looking for those people that I can belong to. So I found it in this gang down in Los Angeles in South Central area. And so they showed me love. They showed me an ability to belong. And so after getting a little bit of trouble and us moving to Kern County, I ended up moving to the east side of Bakersfield. And guess who the first people that I bumped into or wanted to join? Those guys, right? Why? Because I felt like I belonged. I felt like I was back at home. So, you know, and you could take the kid out of the hood, but you can't take the hood out of the kid, right? You know, so programs have to be individualized. They have to be individualized. Shane mentioned the criminal gender risk and needs assessment. You know, so that's what probation does. So us on the side of school social work, we look at the biopsychosocial. We want to know what happened biologically. We want to know what's going on psychologically, and what are the social factor environments, the stressors are causing you to go into this thing. You know, we want to find, so it's got to be individualized. Yes, we can have mentoring. Yes, we can have all these things. But you know what? A treatment plan is not going to work unless it's individualized. How many of you guys have ever had the flu or some kind of sickness when you ended up in ER? Right? Many of us, right? So when you go to the doctor doesn't say, well, you know what? Yes, you have the flu. We're going to put a cast on you. Why? Because that's the flavor of the week, right? That's what everybody's getting when they're coming in. No, they're going to run some tests. They're going to do some x-rays. They're going to do whatever it is to create that specific treatment plan for you, because that's what's going to work for you to get better. That's exactly what needs to happen to these kids, to these adults. The plans have to be individualized in order to get them better.
On the, oh yeah,
If
absolutely.
this may be changing the direction a little bit, so if it does, we don't have to address it. And the question's gonna just reveal that my ignorance has no depths, to be honest. But one thing that I think about just being a person in the world and listening to this panel is, you know, with our youth, there seems to be the focus, we are fortunate to have a public defender and a DA here, and it looks like a collegial relationship, right? Even though there at times you may be fighting for different things, you're able to sit next to one another and be working towards this rehabilitation goal. And it seems like perhaps from a layman's perspective, that there's this shared philosophy when it comes to youth. Until I turn my ignorance has like no bounds here. But and then you hear Shay talk about how over the last 10 years, the numbers of youth basically being in custody have dropped. Do you think if the focus with adults would be more rehabilitative based as opposed to punitive, you would see similar results? And I know, like Melissa, I'm so ignorant, I don't have your specialty, but I would like to, but I can't help but be curious about that.
Absolutely.
So,
I'll let her go first.
I know it flips the switch a bit, but I can't help but think that this entire time.
So, commenting on the relationship between the public defender and the district attorney and how it seems that there's a collegial relationship in that at least they're working together, right, for the common interest, and there might even be a common interest in rehabilitation. Well, there is a common interest in the rehabilitation of the minor. if there was more of a rehabilitation focus on adults, would that also similarly reduce the number of prosecutions that we're seeing, as we've seen a decline in juvenile prosecutions, which I'm sure is not the right word, but you know what I mean.
So here's my thoughts on that. We do, to some degree, focus on rehabilitation in adult court in the sense that they're given numerous opportunities when they're committing low-level crimes to not go to prison. We had long ago, we had what was called PC 1000. The first time you got caught with drugs, you went through a program, it was dismissed if you completed it. Then we had what was called Prop 36 treatment, where it was, they were on felony probation, and the focus was treatment. Because we know that when people have a drug problem, that causes them to commit a whole other lot of crimes that can be very dangerous. And so we had that Prop 36 where that we could force treatment, basically, because you had the threat of going to jail or prison holding over them. Now, the legislature, now it has all changed, and drug offenses are misdemeanors, straight possession. So we no longer have PC 1000. We no longer have Prop 36 treatment because it's just a misdemeanor and there's nothing basically holding over their head. To get people to go to treatment, the majority of the people, they're not going to get treatment until you make them go get it, until there's the threat of something more serious hanging over them. And so I think that there has been that, and I think that when you look at, and especially with AB 109, where the low-level crimes, you're not going to prison anymore. You are going to jail, and then you get out and you have all these programs and what have you that are supposed to be focusing on rehabilitation to some degree. I'm not saying it's full-on rehabilitation like in juvenile. It's not that. But there is other stuff that's going on. And so now only the most serious crimes are people going to prison. And there's nothing really holding over their head. And even now for going to prison, if you're on parole, your parole violation is maybe 10 days in the county jail. That's it. It used to be 6 months in prison if you had something. And I'm not saying that solved the problem. There were still people obviously offending, but in my opinion as a prosecutor, the justice system and the punishments have become so lax that they don't, on most crimes, have really any teeth anymore to do anything about that. That's my view as a prosecutor. I'm sure Robin has a very different opinion as a defense attorney, but there is our justice system and our criminal justice system, from the perspective of a prosecutor, is just being it's horrible what's happening from my perspective, again, as a prosecutor, because we cannot punish for certain things that we used to be able to. For drugs, I just really think that's a huge thing, because I really do truly believe that the heart of a lot of the serious crimes, people are committing robberies because they need money for their drugs. And if we could treat that way back at the beginning, that would be great, but we don't have that ability really anymore to do that, and I think that's a shame.
My thoughts are different. I have 2 words. That's right. 3 strikes. There you go. It didn't work. We know it didn't work. The evidence shows us it didn't work. You can't just lock people up and throw away the key and talk about substance abuse as if it is not an illness. The other thing, you have to consider the cost. And if we did a true cost-benefit analysis, number one, we know that even for adults, I think most all adults are done with their criminal life by the time they're 35. People get too old for this. There's always going to be some in prison, but the rest of us just get too old and too tired. So you have to have programs that are available for substance abuse. It's one of the things we're seeing now. And this whole notion that we're going to lock up the homeless for being homeless and make them go to drug treatment. Number one, it's probably not going to work when you force people to go into treatment. And number 2, you have to have the programs available, and we simply have not done that. We haven't put a priority on it, and unless and until we do that, we're not going to solve those problems. But do I think that rehabilitation would have an impact? Yes. If you look, juvenile crime is down 80% from 2005. There are lots of reasons. We don't really know why that's happened, but I'd like to think some of it is the rehabilitative efforts, because that is just such a huge, significant drop. We know that it's having an impact.
Well, I think it's difficult to actually provide the level of services that you do to an adult offender population than you do to a juvenile. For example, in juvenile hall, our ratio of youth to staff is 1 to 10. At Lerdo, I think it's 2 to 196. So the amount of money I think that it would take to really provide the level of services to the adult population to be really truly rehabilitative would be astronomical. I think on a juvenile level, we have a smaller population, we have a smaller staff to youth ratio, and we have a lot more programming that is available.
But of course, it's a lot cheaper to do a rehab program, because I think the cost for youth at DJJ is, I want to, $323,000 per year, because the staffing at DJJ, despite the fact that the numbers are down, like 90%. Of course, part of that was due to a federal lawsuit. But since that time, there are, I think, I checked today, 744 youth in DJJ, and there used to be over 10,000. And now today, there are, 744? Oh, and this is how you know it's the boys who are the problem. There are 26 females. So you got to ask yourself why that disparity as well.
I'm tempted to comment on that, but I may. Go ahead with the question.
Well,
Can you tie the question into your answer?
So basically I work in the juvenile world, so adults typically, if they're sentenced to local time in custody at jail, you're going to stay locally. But if you commit an offense that goes to prison, then you're basically going to this huge system of the California Department of Corrections, and you're assessed and you go wherever they say you go. So, me personally, do I think family engagement is important, especially for reentry? Absolutely. And is it hard to see your spouse that might be 7 hours away, and how do you take your children? How do you maintain that relationship? Especially if, phone calls cost money and things. So, but that's a different world though too, adult versus juvenile.
But a lot of the juveniles have parents who have been in prison.
Correct.
So if they can't, it's the cycle is hard to break.
Oh, absolutely.
With the collaborative process towards rehabilitation, how do you handle it if the parents aren't supportive? Do the parents have a role in what happens, and what do you do when there's a disagreement there?
So Robin is the one that has to deal with the parents as the defense attorney. And I think that a lot of times the parents are the problem as to why the kid is even in the justice system to start with. And then secondly, a problem that I've noticed they have is they're trying to deal with the kid, but the parents want to have a say in what happens, and they think that their kid did nothing wrong, and they think that they're a good parent, and so why should we be in this system, and why should we be having to go through these things because I did everything right? And so obviously Robin can probably address that far better than I could, but I think that there's been cases where I've talked to the defense attorney, I've talked to Robin or one of the other public defenders, we've worked out something, the minor's all on board, and mom's like, no, and the kid won't do it, and it causes all kinds of problems. For Robin, not for me.
that is true. Sometimes the parents are difficult. I'm thinking of this case the other day where my kid was going to get released and the dad started talking. And thinking he was helping. Sometimes parents are problems, but the bottom line is, and I'll tell the parents, sometimes I have them sit in and sometimes I don't, because I don't represent parents, only children. So if it's helpful, We will meet with the parents, and we always ask the minors' permission, because the parents are not entitled to all the information, at least I don't think so, unless the kid shares it. Now, it's hard to put the kid on the spot. Well, do you want your mom to come in the office here? Well, what's he gonna say? No, because usually mom comes on in. But technically, we only represent the minors, but I'm sure probation, we all have stories that parents can sometimes make things go south very quickly. But for the most part, I think they're pretty good.
And I think that one thing is some of our cases that we have, the parents are the victims. And the kids are out of control. And a lot of times, so the parents call the police because they've had it, or they're hurt, or a sibling is hurt, or something like that, because they want it to stop, right? Just like kind of domestic violence. They call the cops because they want it to stop. And so they call the cops because they want it to stop, because they just don't know what to do with their kid anymore. And so then it goes to probation, they get arrested. I file a case, and then the parent comes in and doesn't want to, and I understand, I'm a parent, doesn't want to prosecute. They don't want to have to get up and testify, my kid did this, this, and that, and what the consequences for their child might be. And so I think that is part of where I have to deal with the parents, because we do have several cases where the mom, the dad, the guardian, grandparents raising their grandkids and things like that. And that is very difficult. And they come to me and they'll say, it did, they won't deny that it happened. It did happen, whatever happened. But they're like, I don't know what to do with my kid. And just as a side note, I would say that, not all of the parents are bad. There is, I would say, a majority of the parents that come into court want their kid to be held responsible and to get help and to fix the problem, so to speak, to get rehabilitated. It's not all the parents. We just have some stories of some crazy parents. But that is where I deal with them, is when the parent's the victim, and I just have to talk to them and say, I can help you if you go in there and testify, because then we can get them on probation, we can get them services and things like that. I cannot help you, from my perspective, if you don't want to come in and testify. And it's very hard on the parents. They're very upset. I try to be very understanding, because, again, I'm a parent. I get it. But sometimes, tough love. You have to come in there and do what needs to be done so that we can get them the services that they need.
So if you're a juvenile probation officer, you're dealing with the parent, the grandparents, the aunt, the uncle, everyone. So typically, you're really involved in the youth's family life, so you kind of see everything there. So we try to provide the appropriate referrals into the community to help support families. If there's a high level of dysfunction in the family, we'll refer to WRAP services, and it's just kind of wrapping around a family, providing a parent partner, a youth partner, mental health workers, probation, kind of trying to support the family. And you have the gamut of everyone, where you will have parents that don't even want to participate in these programmings and don't even care what their kid does, to the extreme where you have a parent calling you every day asking for help me, my kid didn't come home last night, they left again at 5 a.m. So, you really do see the extreme, and as a probation officer, you really have to be, really proactive and being there for the parents, as, even if they don't want to do anything, to the ones who are calling you 55 times that day to come get their kid.
I think we need to get the parents involved at a very young age. Working for probation, I watched kids come in. Back in the days, they used to lock them up for not for serious cases, but for GTAs and things like that. So those kids will slowly graduate to eventually, when next time they will come in, they come in for murder. They will slowly graduate. Not all of them, but some would. One day I asked this kid, as I was transporting him back to take a shower and stuff, I asked him, "Hey man, I see you over and over," but as we were going down the hallway, he was like saying hi, "Hey sir, I'm back, hey look at me," because that's where he belonged. That's where he felt like he belonged. And so one day I watched them during their visit, I watched him interact with his mom, and he totally disrespected his mom. And next time I had him, I had him doing some details where he was cleaning the floor, And I had asked him, I said, hey, I need you to get this done. Here you go. And he goes, okay, sir, got it. And just jump into it, started doing it. So I started having a conversation with him. I said, hey, let me ask you a question. I said, I saw you on Sunday with your mom, your interaction with her, and you totally disrespected her. You know, this is the person that loves you, comes in on a Sunday, she gets patted down up there. I mean, I wouldn't want my mom to do all that. But you disrespect her, you disobey her. But yet me, a total stranger, I'm telling you, get on your knees and scrub this floor. You're like, okay, sir, without even questioning, why? Why? I said, you know, and so then, you know, he thought about it and he goes, hey, sir, because in here, I feel that, you know what, I know where my meal's gonna come from, no one's gonna hurt me, and I know what's gonna happen tomorrow, you know. And I think the thing is that a lot of parents don't provide the structure and this discipline, because that's what he was doing. He was creating that discipline and that structure. And I think by involving our parents at a younger age, now when they're talking about these other kids who are just made the ultimate sin and heading off to prison, you know, that might be a little too late, but maybe they have siblings at a younger age that can learn these skills, how to provide the structure, how to provide this discipline. And so, you know, they're mentioning, you know what, hey, we have a parent website. I don't hear probation or anybody making those referrals to Parent Project. So, you know, they can go to www.currentparentproject.org and make that referral, because we have tons of parent education classes and how to teach them these skills. Because you know what? You can teach them. You know, it's like, how do you get a person to repeat the same behavior? It's providing that positive reinforcement. And so there's tons of parenting education out there that we can really provide to the parents.
So, Robin, you mentioned that there are a lot of children of color still in the system. And I'm wondering what's actually changed to either maintain those rates, increase those rates, or lower those rates? Has there been any kind of support, and why is this issue continuing to persist?
Oh my God, that's a $64,000 question. There's racial disparities. I mean, that's just a fact. We see it, I see it. I swear there have been times where I know and I think the judge didn't realize it. But I think we're making strides. I'm not sure why that is. Some of it has to do with poverty and just the nature of where we are as a society. But I can tell you, and you'll see in here, there are a disproportionate number of youth of color that are prosecuted for the same offenses. I'll tell you that. And that's not on Melissa necessarily, but it just is a fact. And I can see that youth of color, when they come in, there is an implicit bias, I believe, that they are assumed much more likely to be members of a gang. I have had those questions asked of me as their counsel when there is nothing to indicate that, but a youth of color, I believe that is part of the implicit bias that exists. And so I think every day we all strive to limit our own thoughts about that and limit, try to learn and try not to be biased. But the implicit bias is very much present, and it's clear in the numbers. Now, I don't know how probation keeps track of that, but I think we all try every day.
Yeah, we do keep demographics of every arrest based on gender, age, and color, or race, actually. So primarily Hispanic in Kern County. So.
But it's really hard. It's really hard. And you're seeing it, I mean, no offense, in the schools. It's why DHF did the lawsuit against the schools. We've seen it in the way the Kern County high school system expels students because of that. Oftentimes we see kids who have been expelled from their regular school. We know that's also connected with race. And so I think on every level, we really need to fight it on every single level, starting at the school. Because education, we always ask the kids, as I said, where do you go to school? Are you in a regular high school? Because that's probably the best thing a kid can tell me, I'm at a regular high school. because so many of our youth are not, for reasons that, 25 years ago would never have gotten you expelled. Or, excuse me, quote, a voluntary transfer.
Yeah, you know,
Because that's what we see,
I'll
and it's
take-
not voluntary.
I'll take that, Robin.
I know.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel your pain, and again, us in the school, we have to get better. We have to get better, and I think the schools are trying to get better. When we'll get there, I don't know. The thing is that most Hispanics, more African American families, they're growing in the neighborhood. They're in the neighborhood. They have a different structure. They have a different culture. And you know what? The people that are providing that education don't understand that culture, don't understand that system, those the norms that live in the neighborhood. And you put a kid who's been experiencing all this trauma, and then you put them on the spot, the teacher's most likely to lose, because this kid's gonna have an explosion. He's gonna explode. Before you know it, absolutely, she's right. He's gonna go to the dean's office, and then before you know it, this kid's expelled. He goes to community school. And what happens at the community school? Unfortunately, we don't control for deviancy. You put it's kind of like talking about the group homes. You put a bunch of traumatized kids in a group home, adolescents, man, you're gonna got a bad mix. You do the same thing. You put a bunch of deviant kids inside a school system, they're gonna learn from each other. Yeah, you see it in juvenile hall. You see kids learn how to become better criminals because while they're in the institution, they got nothing but time and communicate how to get better at what they do. So yes, we have to get better. We have to be more in the neighborhoods and providing these different interventions to the families.
Looking at the disparity across different races in our community and the correlation between fatherlessness in the home, as we've already said, this is pretty much like a male issue, where it's the majority of men. How do we address in our society as a whole, across all the races, the issue of fathers not being at home? Because we've clearly learned that without the authority and the discipline, not saying mothers can't do that, but without a dual parent household, how do we address that lack of fatherlessness in the home?
Well, I'm going to take issue with the notion that fathers are the disciplinarians, and but that's probably, from my perspective, a discussion for another panel, because that question is kind of loaded.
So the question was really going towards the fatherlessness in single-family or single-parent households, and there isn't an increase in single-parent households. There's a relationship probably to the number of those in juvenile justice system, but unless anyone wants to address kind of how do we address the issue of fatherlessness or single-parent.
I would just say that, as we've talked about already before, is that the majority of the kids are in the system because of their home life, and it's not necessarily because there's no father, there's no mother, there's whatever. It's their home life, I would say, as a whole, and whatever that might be, whatever that situation is, whatever it looks like. I think that's, more the focus is, or where the kids come from. It's not necessarily because they don't have a father, because you could have a single mom that is just amazing and does everything that she can for that kid, and they could still end up in the system. And you could have two parents in the home. We have a lot of cases where there is two parents in the home. We have cases, from Northwest Bakersfield. You think, when you talk about demographics there in Bakersfield, we have cases from all over Bakersfield, all over Kern County, and all different types of homes, all different types of family makeups, and so what we need to address is how to help whoever that parent figure is, help that family as a whole with the rehabilitation. And part of the probation, when they read their probation terms to the kid, the judge always looks over, this is for you, mom, or this is for you, dad, or this is for whoever. And so if we help address that, and Shay talked about the WRAP services. Those are services that go into the home, whether there's one parent, two parent, whatever, and teach them and give them the skills to deal with whatever it is their kid's going through. So I think that the focus should be on helping whatever that family unit looks like to rehabilitate and support that child to be a productive adult.
So before we even get to the rehabilitation, there's a decision that someone is making, and it might be law enforcement, and it might be the schools. And my understanding is that if a police officer picks up one of my boys, they have a decision to remand them to parent custody or to kind of submit them in. I don't know if they technically, if they're supposed to have that. Do they have guidelines? Is it a bright line rule of when they're supposed to pass on a juvenile offender to law enforcement and kind of go through the process versus take them home, kind of yell at them, scare at them, and then give them back to the parents? And the same both with law enforcement and within the schools.
I would say it is probably case by case and what the officer decides to do. There's no rule in the Welfare and Institutions Code that says you have to let these kids go, you have to detain these kids. And I think just from what I've seen in the cases that we have, the cops are looking at the seriousness of the case. You know, if you go in somewhere with a gun, you're probably going to juvenile hall. You're not going home to your parents. And then I think that they also do look at who they're taking that child home to and try to figure that out. And then again, when we talk about the cases where the parents are the victims, a lot of times those kids are being detained for the evening because you can't leave them there because they just got in this huge fight and all this, happened. And so I think it is a case-by-case basis. And then once they're at juvenile hall, then it is to probation. And they look at a lot more than, and they have the time and the resources to be able to look at a lot more than the cop does on the scene to be able to determine, let's call this parent and get the parent down here, or let's keep this kid.
And probably one of the things, I suspect, getting back to your question about kids of color and the income issue, at least poor kids might be more likely to show up at juvenile hall. I'd hesitate to guess that that is a fact. At the same time, I think officers are pretty good about using their discretion, but sadly, and I have learned this because of other groups that I'm involved in, there is no real training for officers on how to deal with youth. Hard to believe, but unless they're officers actually in the school, BPD does not have any particularized training on how to deal with youth, nor does the SO. I will say that the law has changed in terms of how officers deal with youth. They can no longer question a youth who is 15 or under without an attorney. And so we are on call 24/7 to talk to officers and talk to youth who have been arrested as to whether or not they're going to give a statement. So there is now an added, I would say an added protection for youth who generally not only will talk to the police, or used to, and tell them everything. And by the way, not only that, I did this other thing over here, which is bad enough, but of course they also usually videotape it or put it on social media, as Shay can say. But in any event, now they can't be questioned without an attorney.
I'm just curious, why do you think there's such a great disparity between troubled male abuse and troubled female abuse? Not just a boys will be boys answer,
Right,
but
I know, I know.
Well, I'll take that one out. You know what? Don't get mad at me, guys, all right? But you think of the female brain versus the male brain. You know, the female brain matures, that frontal cortex matures a lot sooner than it does for the male brain. So that's one of the reasons. But, going back to the fatherless homes, and I do believe that a boy needs this male role model. Be taught how to respect women, how to respect society, how to be a hard worker, all these pieces that are just not being taught. Boys are learning how to be boys or men by who? By social media, right? They're watching this stuff. So they want to model these things. Young ladies, they're looking for love. They're looking for love. They're looking for somewhere to belong, someone to just say, I love you. And guys are, they have that impulsiveness about them, and they're looking to belong, and they're trying to put in the work, and they're looking at this media, and they're teaching them, you do this, do that, and boom, there you go, there you have it. You know what? And most of the guys that I deal with, not to take away from what they were saying in regards to single mothers. I mean, I work with some tough single mothers, but also most of these kids that we encounter, they're living in a single home, and most likely it's going to be a mom. And now in today's society, it's grandma, and so they don't have that structure. They don't have that role model that tells them, hey, this is how men are supposed to act. This is what you're supposed to do. They don't have that anymore. And so they're learning from these things. They're learning from these things and from, the media. And but again, that's my opinion.
I have to respond. As you might imagine, since I'm co-director of Women's March Kern County, I think the bigger problem is just this whole notion that men need to treat women this way, and women are training men and they're not proper role models. That's the problem. We all need to respect each other. We shouldn't be treating each other different based upon gender. That is, in my view, the core of the problem.
And I would just add, too, that
I'm sorry, and I love Sal and a lot of things he said, but I just had to say that.
And I would just add that, so I've been at Juvenile since January, so coming up on a year. And I would say that I think we've seen a little bit of an increase with girls being a little violent, especially at school. I can't believe the number of cases that I've seen where these girls get in fights. And I'm not just talking going up and slapping or punching somebody, full-on brawls, and people are videotaping them. And I just think it's crazy. And so I think that there has been, I'm not saying that there's like a bunch more girls in court now or anything like that, but just the increase in violence from a girl that I think that we're starting to see. And I don't know why, but and I would say that even when I was in the adult system, I did domestic violence cases, and we are starting to see a lot more women being abusers than there's obviously a significant amount more of men domestic abusers than there are women, but we were starting to see increased amount in women being domestic abusers. And so I don't know why, but there's been a little bit of an increase in violence with girls.
Our capacity for juvenile treatment for females is 23, and it's at our Pathways program. And so that is, much smaller than our treatment facilities for boys that we have. And you do see that girls have a definite set of more needs, a lot of trauma, a lot of CSEC with our female youth. Not that it doesn't happen to our male youth also.
Tell them what CSEC means.
CSEC means criminally sexually exploited child. So we have some of our youth that are victimized by being prostituted. We have a lot of our female youth that have been victimized. So there's just definitely a lot of different dynamics. I know that we're talking about differences in gender, but some of the things that, you have a lot of victimizations for some of our female youth that may not be coming out where they're not stealing cars or, robbing stores, but they have some maybe crimes that is based upon their victimization. They may be stealing because they don't have money because they didn't get anything to eat. It's because they've been on a circuit being trafficked. So some of it's definitely, you think of us as something that you really don't see, but until you see these children's lives that have been impacted, it's a real thing, and it's here in Kern County, and we are doing a better job at addressing the needs of these youth.
I don't have an opinion on it, but one of the things that I found in my research was the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and they do these facts and publications, and this is nationally. There's been a decline in the number of arrests of males and also minors, and also a decline in the number of females, but the proportion of arrests has increased for females, so it's 30% at a national level. So 30% of minor arrestees are female. We're going to speed round, and one of the questions was, what's the most common type of case you've seen? Another one of those statistics on a national level is that simple assault or other person violations is 29% for juvenile offenses. Obstruction of justice or other public order is 25%. And drugs, 13%, and the largest is property crimes, including larceny, theft, and other property. Does that ring true for Kern County?
I think that sounds about
Yeah.
right. I think it does.
Mostly assault, yeah.
Yeah, mostly assault, and there's just a ton of kids fighting at
Right.
school or meeting somewhere after school. And the good thing for me as a prosecutor is all these other kids are videotaping it and putting it on Snapchat, and so I have a video of it.
Yeah, please don't. Right.
What, and the question is specifically for Ms. Walters, but I want to open it up to the rest of the panel as well. What made you choose the path to the Office of Public Defender for juvenile specifically, and for the others, your specific role as relating to juvenile justice?
Gosh, I ended up, as I said, I was not with the public defender until January, so I was in private practice doing criminal defense, and I had finished a death penalty case and became a parent, and I just couldn't do and continue in that kind of work and also be a parent, a single parent. And so I switched over to juvenile, and I absolutely love it. I think it is a completely underrated area of the law. Not only is it dynamic and there's all kinds of issues, you can do trials, and we're lucky enough to also represent dependent youth. So you get to have the whole litigation if you like to be a trial lawyer, which I do. You get that experience, but it's truly an area where I think we would all agree we can make a difference every day.
I've always worked in domestic violence, child abuse, those types of cases, and I was just reassigned to this, to the juvenile unit in January. And the way I look at it is that, my focus was always on helping kids, as victims and women as victims of domestic violence. There were some men victims of domestic violence too. And so for me, it's still being able to help the youth to the degree that I can. So that's how I ended up there.
And I think for most people that are probation officers, you want to, help people. You want to be able to affect change and provide people opportunities to make a difference in their life. And, that's something that drew me. And so, for 8 years of my career, I worked in adult, but for the majority of my career, I've been working with youth. And it's really satisfying to be able to hopefully be able to make an impact, lay a brick for a foundation for someone to eventually build a house.
For me, you would ask me when I was a youngster if I would ever work for education, I would tell you no. I came back from the military, worked for probation department, and that was going to be it. When I saw this job about being a gang prevention counselor, that was it for me. I mean, I was so stoked that I could go back and work with kids that were like me. And so I could make that impact. And that's how I ended up in education, working with gang members. I became an administrator now, and I miss going back and working with my Norteño kids, my Sureño kids. I miss that. But you get led into different paths. But that's why I came into the role that I do.
And the final question for each of you is, what opportunities are there for the community and specifically CSUB students to be involved with juvenile programs to help the youth?
I don't know about specifics, but what I would say is just being a mentor to somebody. You as college students could be great mentors to give, because I'm sure there's people in here that have trauma in their life and a bad background or something like that, but look where you're at, you're in college. And I think that you could really mentor some of the youth from the system to say, look where I've gotten, and you can help them get there.
I think there are lots of opportunities, just like Melissa said, in your daily life, in your interactions with others. I also think that it would be nice I know we do it, as I said, for MSW interns, so maybe there's an opportunity in the future, because I'm always happy to have young people around, and we've had young people going to law school help work in the office and shadow us and see what we do, so I'm always open to that possibility. Also, I would suggest CASA, because CASA is court-appointed special advocates. They used to just do foster youth, and by that I mean children who are removed for abuse and neglect, but they have now expanded, and they have a program for justice-involved youth, and it really is fantastic. The CASA training is tough, but it's really wonderful, and I just would encourage, basically, that CASA sees a youth who doesn't have the family support that we've all talked about and how important it is. So the CASA is the one person in that youth's life who is a constant, and it's a wonderful program, and so I wholeheartedly advise you if you want to do it.
Actually, I brought some career information if anyone would like to see me afterwards. One of the jobs that I had when I was going to Cal State Bakersfield was as a group counselor in our facility. It's an extra help position that you actually work with the youth that we serve, and it works around your school schedule. So I, got my degree while working as an extra help juvenile corrections officer. I also, we have opportunities for internships with probation, volunteers with probation. We also have, for those that are above the age of 18, to be able to work in one of our facilities as a volunteer. We do some mentorship. There's just all kinds of opportunities. So if you're interested in that, just contact the probation department. But we can't also forget we have a lot of community-based organizations out there that are very good, that would love to have your support. Stay Focused Ministries, ground level, grassroots, doing a lot of community-based outreach. You also have Garden Pathways that are doing mentoring programs with juveniles as well as adults. You have just Youth for Christ. There's, who is it? Stay Focused.
Stay focused. Garden Path.
So there's a lot of the community that really, that need your support. These organizations don't have a lot of money, so they do rely on volunteers. And so if you want to kind of get a taste of, giving back, there's some good areas in our community.
I'm gonna second that motion in regards to Shay, I came to college while working for probation, and she's absolutely right. They work around your schedule. That's the only way I went to college, because I had 4 kids, and I went to college. So what can you guys do? I'm not gonna tell you, you're busy, you're working, you're going to school, you're already bombarded. But what you can do is, you guys know someone in your life right now at this moment that might be heading in that wrong path. Reach out to them. Reach out to them, talk to them, and make yourself your personal mentor. You don't have to go that far. You know what? Imagine every single one of you that's in this room reach out to somebody. That's how many people you guys are gonna touch. And that's how many people less you're gonna be sending to them. So that's what you can do.
Thank you. I am going to end on this just because one of the main things that was reiterated was being a mentor. Another statistic I found, Bureau of Children's Justice here in California, 1 in 6 Californians has experienced severe childhood trauma such as abuse, neglect, or violence at home. That's a staggeringly high statistic. It also opens up the door for that ability to be a mentor, especially if you've had a life and you've avoided the juvenile system, or you've gone through it and you're out of it. You're in a great position to really serve as a mentor. Formally would be great, and there's a lot of opportunities to do that, but at a bare minimum, informally, right? Just by being a friend and being someone that they can look up to. I want to thank you for your questions, and to thank the CSUB Pre-Law Society and the Criminal Justice Department, but most especially I want to thank the panelists for their participation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I thought you did good. You didn't give up. Huh? I hope.
When are you going to do, when?
She wants to take our picture.
Okay.
These chairs don't sit.
I know, that's why.
Yeah, there it is.
I think it